has a wide range of interest in Bathurst anyway. He's the Showground Trust Administrator. He's the Carillion Art Custodian. He's the Military Curator for the Bathurst Historical Museum. And he's a researcher looking for stories about Bathurstians who have a story to tell from any battles they've been involved with. I don't think there are any from the Crimean War still around, but maybe the families haven't. And he's searching for stories that haven't been told. You may recall just recently there was an old guy for the 75th anniversary of the victory in the Pacific. He was saying he was really disappointed that none of his family had ever asked him about the stories he could tell. He said they're all in my head still. Nobody's ever asked me. When his family was asked why didn't he talk to them, he said we didn't think he wanted to review all his stories, his bad experiences and so on. So Andrew's now looking for some stories from maybe your relatives, and he's going to give us a bit of an overview of Bathurst's military history. I'll give you Andrew Fletcher.
This is going to be good. Thanks, Wayne. I apologise, but I do normally speak very badly, so if I blow your eardrums, let me know. Some might say that I have an unstable employment history. Certainly in my day, I got worried at one point in my career that my longest job had been the army, and that was only because I couldn't get out. Today, what I want to talk about is a bit of military history that's connected to that. You've all heard the old saying, if we can't remember everything all the time, but we can remember something some of the time. So what I want to tell you today is a couple of stories that will help you remember some of these men and women some of the time. Because as long as we keep remembering, they're still alive. I'm not going to tell you, it's not war stories, it's not no blood and guts or gore in any of this. It's all about what individuals have done. And of course the first thing would be remiss of me not to mention the Second World War. My area of research is First World War, so I'm really glad about the Second World War. I know it existed, my father was in it. VE and VJ Day obviously just the other day. And I'm sure you will join with me on thanking each and every one of those who served throughout the Second World War for their service. What I'm saying is an interesting saying, thank you for your service. I was in the States a couple of years ago, most of my wife's disgrace. We happened to fall into a hotel that was having a Vietnam Veterans Association meeting, which is a bit like our Australian Vietnam Veterans Association meetings. Lots of stories, lots of alcohol, a bit of food, and a few more stories. So of course, in the middle of it, I got tangled up and a particular guy came up and shook my hand and said, thank you for your service. I didn't know what to say. I've never been thanked for time. I don't really think, I didn't think it was worth thanking me for. But in America, you've probably noticed on the TV, they really value their veterans, which I think is particularly important. Because where do we start with history of military involvement in Bathurst? You could say the Battle of Bathurst in 1824. You could say it started before then with the Wiradjuri Nation. The Wiradjuri had the largest land holding in New South Wales. They didn't keep that land holding from being everybody's best buds. They were military active in maintaining their own land holding. So I think our history goes back as far as you wish it to go. So just going back, obviously we had people from Bathurst involved in the Battle of Bathurst. The New Zealand Wars, 1863. Do you reckon anybody from Bathurst participated in those? Sure did. I'm not going to name any of those because that's not the area of my research. John from down at the RSL is researching that, but he tells me so far he's found two Bathurstians who participated in the Barrier Wars. The Sudan War. Everybody's heard of the Sudan War, I'm sure. We were attacked late, we being the Australians. We sort of got there and it was over. So we mucked around for a little while and came back home. But one of the interesting things is Bathurst had a contingent of over 20 men went to the Sudan War. And the officer that was second in charge of the entire contingent came from Bathurst. Lieutenant Colonel Paul. First World War. You may think it's related, but I think it's his nephew at best. Harold served in the Boer War as a private, went away as a private, came back as a lieutenant with a commission. Stayed in the reserves in between the wars when the First World War started. Captain Paul then joined the 20th Battalion in 1915. He survived the war, came home as a lieutenant colonel, but sadly was killed in a car accident just out here at Rydal in 1922. Don't know if anybody here knows Carol Churches. This is her dad. And I read a pile of his letters some time ago, and this is where a lot of this stuff comes from. And this was a phrase that just caught my attention. Herbert used to say, I have a friend day and night. They'll both call Bill day and Bill night. But he had quite a sense of humour, Herbert. His letters, you would think he's probably away on a holiday. His letters are most inspiring. Now, near miss, there's a family in town called the Clooney Ross family. I don't know the name. First, there were four sons. First son to go off was an accountant. They all studied at Sydney University. So Robert headed off, joined the 2nd Battalion. Sandy was killed in action in October 1918, within a month of the end of the war. His brother Edgerton was a journalist working for the Sydney Morning Herald before he too joined. He joined the 19th Battalion and then later swapped over to the South African Army with a commission. He died on the 27th of September 1918. Put yourself in his mother's position at the moment. Two boys gone. Third son, Alan, he graduated from Sydney University with a science degree, joined the 17th Battalion, and was gassed in 1918. And all this time, the youngest son, Ian, had been pestering his mother, as children tend to do, they want something. And he'd been pestering his mother. There we go. He'd been pestering his mother that he wanted to go and enlist. So out of desperation, his mother continually refused him permission to go and enlist. And she said to him, I will let you enlist the day you graduate from Sydney University. You have to finish your degree. Mum was quite canny because the war was over by the time Ian was old enough and finished his degree. He went on to be the first CEO and the first chairman of the CSIRO. Imagine had he gone and he joined the fate of his three brothers. We would not have had this man's contribution to Australia and science. I'm sure you've all heard of Mr. Walker. Bathurst NSW. We've got a lovely park over on the Caribbean. He was born in Bathurst. All these people I'm talking about are born in the district. He joined with his brother, Keith, and he won a DCM, not a Dane Come Under, Distinguished Conduct Medal. His other two brothers, Alexander and Lance, they all survived the war, they all came back. When Blair was awarded his BC, this is an extract from an interview in the paper with his mother. And you might say like my mother, but just the way she speaks, I suppose I ought to be proud of him. Yeah, he's just won a BC. And he's also got a DCM before that. He was always war mad. Can you imagine the lady describing her son? He was always war mad. Most of us that played cowboys and Indians were all soldiers. And then she goes on to say at the end, he was as jolly as a schoolboy. We always called him Smiler. Now here's a guy that's been promoted around the Commonwealth as being a brave individual son, and he was. But mum calls him Smiler. The McStorley's Hotel. Anybody know where the McStorley's Hotel was? Family Hotel. Down on the road. The Stevensons, 4 boys. You can see the outcome. 3 of them killed. 1 returned only after his father made a request to the army to send his son home because he had nobody to look after him. He was now an old man. Luckily, John did return to Australia, but the army in its wisdom, nothing moves very quickly in the army. It took them over 7 months to take him out of the front line trenches, put him on a ship and come home. And sadly, by the time he came, well not sadly, but by the time he came home, the war was actually over. The Redburns of Truckee. Anybody heard of the Redburns of Truckee? And you can read the story there, but one of 4 brothers, so this is John. He enlisted in 1917. In July 1918, he was court-martialed for desertion. And he had deserted from May 1918 through till the end of June. His sentence for that brief interlude was 5 years in jail. Not an unusual sentence. The British didn't muck around with prison sentences, they executed him. And another link with that. You know who the last man was that was executed by the British Army? Peter Hancock. Boer War. Born in Bathurst. So every man who served in the army under the British command after Peter Hancock owes him a debt of gratitude. And that was one of the conditions in the First World War. The Australian government agreed to provide 20,000 men. They never were good at figures. On the proviso that they were always under the control and command of the Australian military. In other words, you can't execute our soldiers. So poor old John, off he goes to jail. Luckily for John, which was not unusual, the following month his sentence was suspended. It's not out of the goodness of their heart. They needed men on the front line, so your sentence is suspended, they give you a gun and send you back to the front. Within a week, John's AWOL again. This was in July. So in November, they find him. So the war's over now. 17th of November, he's arrested. 4th of December, he's court-martialed again. Found guilty again. His sentence this time is 2 years hard labour. In July 1919, that sentence was suspended and he was returned back to Australia. But as you've read there, that was his first explanation as to why he went over. The reason I went absent was that 2 of my brothers had been killed at Messines, and the 3rd was discharged badly wounded. I thought the family had done enough. I tend to agree with them. I think the family had done enough. I like the last line though, I don't intend to go back to the front line, and he never did. Bit of Australian spirit coming out in all this, isn't it? Some of the, you're not going to tell me what to do. Anybody heard of the Gormals from Rankin Street? I could actually talk about this bloke ad infinitum. He's the most interesting character. But the bit I'm going to hone in on for you today is 2 things actually. When Wayne was giving up in my tyres up at the start of the meeting, he mentioned that I'd served in the Signals Corps. Now it's only coincidental, that is the badge of the Signals Corps in the First World War. We have progressed a little bit from semaphore and flags, not a great deal, but as I research these guys, I go looking for the stories and what interests me. It's just coincidental that you will see quite often they belong to the Corps of Signals. No pun intended. But have you ever wondered who was the last man that left Anzac Country? It's been mooted for years. Of course, it has to be an officer. That's mandatory. An enlisted man couldn't possibly be the last person to leave the battlefield. And I know from the research that it's never been totally agreed as to who it was. Closest they got to was the Lieutenant Bloggs, I don't know what his name was. Edgar, though, won a very unusual medal from the Serbian government for holding a telephone line as the troops evacuated from Brisbane. So he and his mate, as the troops are going home, what they used to do was, as they got to the trenches, they would fill one end of the trench with sandbags, just to stop the troops from, if they happened to get into the trenches, they couldn't overrun them. So of course, poor old Edgar and his mate, they're stuck in the trenches, rolling up the cable and the telephone line, and you can guess what happened. Some bugger filled the trenches. So in the middle of the night, these 2 guys had to climb out, and again, put yourself in their shoes. They've been drummed into them for weeks that this is an absolutely secret evacuation of the Brisbane. These 2 buggers are stuck in a trench. The only way they can get out is to climb up on top of the trench, on night time, around the barricade and back into the trench and continue on their way. They did that a number of times, so that's pretty much what the basis of Edgar receiving the Serbian silver medal for bravery. And in a letter home, as you can read there, we overtook the last party as they were stepping on the last remaining motorbike. And here it occurred to me that the last man to leave the Australian firing line was another Earthman. It was me. about you military researchers out there, but the best source of research and information is first-hand. That wasn't a letter that he wrote 40 years later when his mind had wandered and he convinced himself. That was a letter he wrote home within a couple of weeks of getting back to the Middle East. So I'm fairly comfortable to say that the last man to leave politically is Andrew Fletcher. I'm not going to bore you with the rest of his story, but I do want to tell you one more bit. He went on, he was a motor mechanic when he joined the army. He went on to become a fighter pilot. Now it's a little, he works in a garage down here, goes to war, and learns how to fly. I mean, we can't comprehend that. Flying just didn't exist in these guys' childhood. And here's this young man goes away and comes back a fighter pilot. He ended up, he had a hand, later on, had a hand in setting up the first flights between Canberra and Japan. He continued on in his flying career. He did have a bit of a check at life a bit later on, which I'll come and tell you about another day. Those of you who heard me speak before, I have a bit of a thing for the nurses, so to speak. Mainly on the basis that whenever historians or media or somebody talks about war conflicts, no one ever talks about who is supporting the infantry in the front line. The infantry do the work, no doubt about it. But they can't do what they do without a swag of people behind them supporting them. Particularly, if you go back to the First World War, like the nurses were rarely ever mentioned of having been in the war. Everybody knew there was nurses. There was the old St Vincent's Hospital at Cathrock House. There was a convalescent home for the First World War soldiers. Everybody knew we had nurses out there, but they didn't really go and do anything. Well, we had 24 from Bathurst. And Maud is interesting for not only what she did during the war, but what she did afterwards. So she was born in Raglan. She was 41 when she enlisted, 5 minutes after war was declared in August 1914. She, by that stage, was the matron of Sydney Hospital. And she describes her enlistment as packing a bag and walking from Sydney Hospital down to the recruiting centre. So she was quite determined on what she was going to do and where she was going. She did a variety of stuff which I'm not going to go through. She was at the evacuation of Brooklyn. Most of her work was in the Middle East. She did run a British hospital in England. But the bit I liked about her was when the war ended, and as you can imagine, we've been sending thousands upon thousands of wounded men home for years. All their medical records were still in England. So Maud took it upon herself to collect all those medical records and make sure that they were returned back home. She was mentioned in dispatches in 1916. She won a Royal Red Cross, which is this one, first class, in 1917. She won the CBE, which is the lovely blue one on the books, lovely blue one on the end, in 1919. When she returned, she ended up being the principal matron for the Australian Army Nursing Service. And she went on in her private life. She became the president of the Australian Trained Nurses Association. She was a member of the National Council of Women in 1931. radical. We couldn't bring ourselves to admit that women were in war in 1931. And here's this woman on the National Council. She was also the first nursing member on the Nurses Registration Board from 1934 to 43. She was the Australian Nursing Federation member. And out of all that, in 1937, she won what is the highest recognition for a nurse, the Florence Nightingale Medal. And in her spare time, she used to organise reunions from all the war nurses from the Sydney hospital. Not bad effort, really. But I really do like this girl. Muriel, I mentioned before about an Australian, you're not going to tell me what to do. You know? Muriel lined up in that queue twice. She was only one of 7 women who were actively on the hospital ship Gaston on the 25th of April. She witnessed the landing of our Anzac cruise. She was only attached to the Gaston was a British ship. You may have gathered over the years of listening to stories that there was sometimes a bit of a rift between the British and the Australians. Still is. Poor old Muriel and her friend were attached to the Gaston the night before the landing. And as they marched on board, out came the little British matron, who said to them, "The captain has asked me to explain to you he does not want his officers fraternising with colonial nurses." So assumably fraternising with British nurses was okay, it's not you, Betty. The matron gave them a fair bit of curry. And you can see over here, old mate Ray. Ray was the first officer on the Gaston. Muriel married him the next year. There was certainly no fraternisation going on. Very briefly, but I am mindful of the time, the burdens of ACOP. Reggie and Sydney went to war, her 2 brothers. They got caught up in Flamels. We all know about Flamels. We lost 5,533 men in 20 hours. Great effort. Managed by the British for us. These 2 guys, Reg was wounded, he had face wounds. They were in the same battalion, so assumedly Sydney stayed with him. That led to them both being captured. That was the end of their war. They did survive the war, but they spent their wartime in a German prison. Now Edith went off one of those unknown places. She ended up in Salonika, which was a bit of a hellhole for nurses. Served the war and came home. After Ween, anybody know the Ween from Sunny Corner? Anybody go to South Bathurst Primary School? No. There's 4 names up on 4 Weens on the South Bathurst Primary School, and I was up there chatting to the principal one day. And I said, "You know who these guys are?" No. Yeah, nothing about it. Going to tell you a little bit about Arthur. Arthur was 18 when he enlisted. And you can see, well, it was in the signal school, so that almost goes without saying, really. But you can see here, he's got a fairly unique medal. Those of you who are into medals or anything like that, that's a military medal. And when you win the military medal, you get that medal. If you win the military medal again, you get a bar. How many times this bloke won the military medal? 3? Excellent. Because we know we can count. And again, he was one of these guys, he went through, he survived the war, but he just near the end of the war, 1918, he was shot in the shoulder from an aircraft. So it was a heavy calibre weapon that got him. And he had limited use of his left arm for the rest of his life. And when he came home, keep in mind, he's now only a man of 23 years of age. He comes home, he couldn't settle in. He was still doing a lot of rehab, he was still doing a lot of medical treatment. And he ends up applying for and getting a scholarship back in England. Has anybody ever read the book All Quiet on the Western Front? Or seen the movie? Give you a tip, don't watch the movie unless you're having trouble sleeping, but that's the book. Why is that significant? It's actually a story, it's a German story of a German soldier who went to war to fight for his country. Now obviously, when it was written in German. Arthur is the man who translated it into English. And then he got a bit of a kick on, and he translated a number of other books for various authors. And he also wrote, I didn't put that in, but he also wrote a couple of books. One was titled We Talked of Other Things, his story of when he came home, talking to his family. Somebody mentioned before, it was Wayne. The people never talked about their experiences. He wrote a whole book on how he avoided talking to his parents about what he did in war. It's an interesting read. Going very quickly, Edward Lynch from Bathurst. Surprise, surprise, there's another signal. This is him hitting at a shot near the end of the war at St. Quentin. He survived the war. He also wrote those two stories. And you've already twigged by the photo that he went back and served again in the Second World War. John William Clive, so the reason I put John up there, didn't do anything spectacular, he didn't win any bravery medals, but he certainly was an assistant. John served in the Sudan contingent in 1885. He then trotted off to the Boer War, and when the First World War started, at the age of, I think it was about 52, so he lied like everybody else did, and instead of putting his age up, he put his age down. And off he went again to Rabaul and New Guinea. Not very many men can claim to do that. Anybody know we had troops in North Russia in the First World War? You do? That's right. Another little escapade. Those of you who hear me talk from time to time, I'm not a great fan of Winston Churchill when he was a military strategist. He wasn't terribly good at it. Some explained the pain, deliberately, twice. The invasion of Russia. That's a pretty good idea, isn't it? Let's go and invade Russia. But they didn't. Near the end of the war, 1917, there was British troops invading northern Russia. In 1918, our blokes were getting a bit bored sitting around in England because the British wouldn't provide enough transport to bring them home. So they went out and said, anybody want to go and fight in North Russia? And we had two blokes from Bathurst went and fought in North Russia. Of course, Ernest Heathcote is one, but the other guy, I don't have a photo of him regularly here, which is William Martin, but he is in there. That's the bunch of Australians from his unit who went and served in North Russia. I just thought that was a really big episode for a little town. Bathurst at that stage was less than 10,000 people. And we got 2 blokes fighting in Russia. Second World War, anybody remember Bob Wood? Step down, how long have I got one? Bob was a very unassuming individual. As you can see, served in the RAAF in the Second World War. I researched him for his family not too long ago and found out that what he used to do was a tar gunner. So he had a life expectancy of about 3 minutes. He survived the entire war. Had a couple of narrow escapes, I've got to say. But he was a tail gunner in an aircraft called an Albemarle, which was made in a carpenter shop. It was a wooden framed aircraft. He went on, strangely, I think, I knew Bob, he went on to become a cabinet maker. And I'm damn sure that this aircraft hanging together long enough for him gave him enough motivation to go and become a cabinet maker at the end of the war. But what they used to do was they'd fly on their own. One plane outlined from England to France. And their job was dropping SOE spies in behind France. That's why they flew on their own. Not sure about you guys, but I wouldn't fancy sitting in an aircraft for 6 or 7 hours flying on your own. Can I just tell 2 quick stories? Stuart? Because these are ones that we've all lived through. Vietnam War. We've all heard the story. I was only 19, or the song I was only 19. It's now become pretty much the anthem for Vietnam veterans. And the story talks about Frankie Hunt. And the words go, and then someone yelled out contact. And the bloke behind me swore, we hooked him there for hours, then it got almighty wrong. And Frankie picked a mine the day that mankind kicked the moon. God help him. He was going home in June. Very sad story, but I've got a good twist for it. Frankie didn't die that day. Can't believe everything you hear in the song. Frankie did pick a mine that day, and so did anybody know Billy Wilcox from Oakland. He was there, he was mates with Frankie. He will gladly show you his watch, which hasn't moved since the day he was well up. He's fine, and obviously don't know. But next time you hear that war song, I was only 19. You can now take a bit of solace in knowing Frankie didn't die that day. Many others did. And that Billy, a local boy, was there with him. I will just skip to the punchline. Wayne mentioned earlier that I'm interested in looking for stories of local veterans. That's a bit of a gambit. We still have people from Bathurst today in Afghanistan. You wouldn't know. When did you last see a story in the Advocate or the Sydney Morning Herald about an Afghan soldier that was still alive? There's something in there. We're fairly morbid race. We'll write a story about a bloke when he's killed. But as a local community, I find it fairly disappointing that we can't write stories about our soldiers, airmen and Navy guys doing what they're trying to do. This girl down here is a current serving member. This guy was 15 years in Special Forces. I had him as a cadet at the Air Training Corps. Unbelievable individual. Anyway, that'll do me for the moment. I haven't bored you too much, but if you do have any stories you'd like to share with me about any of your ancestors, relatives, friends that have a connection to Bathurst, I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.
Andrew is a blowing to Bathurst. He was not born here. He arrived here, what, 20 years, 30 years ago?
92 or 3.
Let's just say 30 years ago. And in the intervening 30 years, he's fallen in love with Bathurst and the local baseline.
Yeah, she came first.
No. Oh, okay.
That was the attraction to become
But he's fallen in love with Bathurst. And I think, without over-egging it, you can get the idea that he was fallen in love with this town and all its marvellous stories. Not just the military, but that's where Andrew comes from. But the stories, the untold stories of Bathurst, going right back to the production days of the 1820s, 44. And I think what Andrew has done here today is show that this town is not just an ordinary town. This town isn't just another town on the road to somewhere else. This town is a destination for many, many people who come here to live, many people who come here to serve, many people who raise their families here. I think what Andrew has done today is to show us that just one tiny little part of Bathurst, called its military history, shows us rich, it's strong, and it's many, many multi-layered. From people like the Fluties Ross, who went on to form the CSIRO, to other people like Hancock, the last man shot in the Boer War, and you see him in that Brave Moran story. The history of Bathurst is rich, deep, and multi-layered. And I thank Andrew for showing us just one tiny little part of it. We could have had somebody here talking about the pastoral history of Bathurst, and it would still be as rich and as long and as multi-layered. We could have someone talking about